Well, good day to everyone, and happy Wednesday, and thank you so much for joining us. Us today is myself and Annie Repke, who is here with us as well, who will introduce herself in a moment. But we're delighted you're joining us, and hope that wherever you are throughout the U.S. and Canada, it looks like, that you are able to enjoy this pause in your day to reflect a bit on the idea of what it means to facilitate post-traumatic growth with the people that we work with. I am absolutely delighted to have Dr. Anne-Marie Repke with us. I think she's probably likely to tell us that she's fine with being called Annie. But she is somebody who I met in the last few years who comes with a particular interest and expertise in a variety of things, but particularly in this whole area of facilitating post-traumatic growth. So I wonder, Annie, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself briefly. Tell us a bit about yourself, and then I'll say a bit about myself, and we'll move on.
Sure thing. Well, good morning, folks, and welcome. And indeed, as Ken said, you're welcome to call me Annie. So I am a clinical psychologist. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and I'm really, really glad to be here unpacking post-traumatic growth together today because it's really the topic that inspired me to want to be a psychologist and to do research on this topic of post-traumatic growth. So my background as a psychologist is the study of both clinical psychology, which is mostly about human suffering and how to alleviate it, and then also positive psychology, which is mostly about human thriving and flourishing and how to foster that. So what I'm really interested in is where those two things intersect and how to understand how we can really promote the best outcomes and as much growth and well-being and flourishing as possible in the hardest of circumstances. So I've done a fair amount of research on post-traumatic growth, and these days what I do is about half of my time I do private clinical practice where I'm doing therapy, and the other half of the time I do training and consulting related to these topics that have to do with both alleviating suffering but also fostering resilience and growth, building motivation. I'm a motivational interviewing trainer and other topics along those lines. So thank you, Ken and C4, for inviting me to join the webcast today. Turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And just a wee bit about myself, I am a social worker by training, and most of my career I've been working at the nexus of health, behavioral health, and healthcare, healthcare and behavioral health, but also homelessness and housing. That's kind of been the intersection where I found myself. Initially doing direct service work in a large shelter program in downtown Seattle where I'm located, and then for the last 2 decades doing more developing curricula, teaching and training around best practices in how to work with people in the most effective way possible. So a lot of what I envision myself doing is trying to equip others in the field of passing on lessons I've learned and whatever knowledge I can pass on, and tapping into your already existing knowledge and wisdom as well. So today our focus will be for the next hour on trauma and then post-traumatic growth. So those two kind of different ends of the spectrum, if you will, around suffering and around recovery or how we can move forward in our lives towards healing. And just to let you know contextually, this is an hour-long webcast that's intended to be kind of a precursor, a teaser for a 5-week training that Annie and I will be co-facilitating together in the fall, starting on October 22nd. And you can learn a lot more about that if you go to the website of C4 Innovations. And we'll have a little more information at the end as well. So I'll begin with a brief overview of trauma, its impact, and why it matters. And then for the most part of the time together, Annie will take a bit of a deeper look at post-traumatic growth. So for those of you who like to have an idea of a roadmap where we're going, we hope that from this you'll be able to explain why trauma-informed practice matters, and also then be able to define post-traumatic growth and some common examples of what that looks like, and at least one factor or more that makes it likely that that will occur. So I want to start with some images for you, and these will be familiar images. That's the first one. I'm always kind of amazed by how intriguingly interesting, even beautiful this image is, and yet how terrifying it is too, based on the cause of this coronavirus that is taken siege of the world. And of course, here in the U.S., we're now at about 178,000 people who have died, over or close to 6 million cases of infections. And of course, that's just in this country. And of course, we have done what we can to prevent it, and yet there's so much more that could and can be done. But this is part of the trauma that we're living in. This is a traumatizing time related to this pandemic. And then there's the overlay, of course, of this arising and uprising of once again having some renewed kind of interest and noticing of the inherent and deep racism that's been part of our country for years. And so unfortunately it takes dramatic killings and deaths in order to bring this back to our attention. But there is a movement taking place, a movement that's not just about Black lives, about Indigenous lives, about brown lives, but it's really focused right now on helping us understand how people who have been marginalized and oppressed across centuries have not been given the voice. And so we're hearing the rise of anti-oppressive and anti-racist kinds of calls for change. And on top of that, I'm going to use this image as just kind of an image of chaos and apocalypse and craziness. We're faced with incredible economic instability that is ongoing, worsening poverty. We're also looking at political polarization like we've probably never seen quite like this in our history. We have conspiracy theories that are abounding. We have a lack of regard for facts. There's climate change on top of this, and then that's not even to mention all of the interpersonal violence and all of the things that make up the trauma of our lives as well. So sorry to paint such a morbid picture so early in the morning here for those of you for whom it's morning, but I think it's important that we recognize that these are indeed traumatic times, extraordinarily traumatic times, I would say. And I came across this quote from the Traumatic Stress Institute. He says, what does trauma-informed care, or how does it fit into all this? And, they ask rhetorically, is it something we put aside until life gets back to normal? And of course, what they come out saying is that this is absolutely when we need to be thinking about and practicing trauma-informed approaches for ourselves, with ourselves, and also with others. And so let's take a look at trauma a little bit, because I will say this. Trauma impacts different people differently at different times. And sometimes we get angry and we fight back and we are agitated. Other times we try to move away from it all as much as possible as we can, mentally, emotionally, even physically. And then there are times when we just kind of numb out, when things just, we can't take it all. It's overwhelming, and we kind of get this glaze over our eyes, much like you see in the image here. And I'm going to guess that all of us on this call have had all of those experiences, and they keep repeating themselves in different patterns. And I bring this up just to say that trauma, it's everywhere. Even though you might feel like you're doing okay, I think when we step back and really explore how we're thinking, how we're feeling, how our brain is working, how our social relationships are being impacted, and all of these things, we realize that these are crazy-making times. So trauma is obviously very relevant. And I want to just move from that to say this, that this is kind of giving away the secret of what is trauma-informed practice. I've come to think of it as a sum total of hundreds of thousands of mostly small words and tiny actions. And I would invite you in the chat box just to type in a few things in a word or a phrase that actually constitute what you might call trauma-informed practice. Not necessarily in a clinical way, although it can be, but just in general, what are the small things that we're doing day in, day out, just to counteract, if you will, the incredible stress and traumatic stress that we're experiencing? I know for myself, even things like saying please and thank you more deliberately is helpful. So facilitating safety, absolutely, Risa says, and recognizing triggers and having a bit of a guarded disposition, but allowing oneself still to be open to what's going on, listening without assuming, absolutely, this presence and smiling, the focus on positives, emphasizing choice, all of the things that are so important always, and particularly in these times. And this open-mindedness, a sense of welcome, a hierarchy of needs, yeah, these are all things that are incredibly important. And I would suggest to you that every small thing you do, for yourself as well as for others, on behalf of others, is all part of trauma-informed practice. There are, of course, structural and systemic things that come along with this too, and I don't want to disregard that. But I want to suggest that we're all practicing in a trauma-informed way all the time, partly for our survival, and partly, though, to make the world just a little bit more livable and life-giving. So thank you for those contributions. Why does this all matter? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that we know that these experiences directly impact people, and it directly impacts people's overall health and well-being. And many of you are familiar with the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and we know from that study that people's health and well-being are dramatically impacted by trauma. We also know that these experiences directly impact how people engage with us in services and care, and how we engage with other service providers in our own care as well. And we recognize that oftentimes things go off the rails a little bit because we're not thinking clearly, or we're being triggered ourselves, or we're reacting instead of responding to people. We also know that while we're working with people, if someone discloses a current or past trauma of any kind, that we need to know how to respond to that. Even though we're not trauma therapists, we certainly can acknowledge the trauma and help people feel heard and seen and taken into account. We also know that knowing the impact of trauma as providers of care can also help people improve their health outcomes. And then in addition to that, we can better manage risk if we know what we're looking at. And I often sometimes think about the example of somebody who, we know that some people who experience extreme trauma will do some form of self-cutting or burning or things that don't quite seem imaginable or logical to our minds. And yet when we understand that these are actually, most of the time, they're actions that are taken to feel more alive and to just feel like you're a body that has feelings. I know sometimes we also think about it as, calling attention to oneself and even being potentially suicidal. But I think by and large that's not likely the case. And so this is one example I think of about managing risk and understanding the intent behind that. A few more things. We know that people will often be avoidant in how they engage. We often know that they'll be fearful of trusting us, even though you might feel you're the most trustworthy person in the world. There's no reason for somebody to believe that about you because they don't know you, and perhaps their whole experience has been affected by people who have acted as if they were trustworthy only to turn around and control and exploit them. I often think it's important to understand that some people will be more comfortable with what I'll call transactional relationships, which in essence means that that's the kind of a relationship where you kind of take as much as you can from somebody else in a variety of ways and give up as little as possible in return. And it's more of a business relationship. It's sort of what we do when we purchase things. We try to get things from somebody else for as little, to give up as little money as we can. But this is different than transformative relationships and relationships that are more mutual. But this is also a survival tool. This is the way one learns oftentimes how to interact in the world. When people have difficulty keeping appointments, things like these, we can understand that oftentimes as being related to fear and avoidance and poor decision-making, memory impairment, and more. And you're welcome to type in other things that come to your mind. These are just a few. But I trust that you find these, that you can relate to these things and notice how they in fact do have an impact on how people engage with us. And then we need to know, as people who are trauma-informed, how to respond in a way that doesn't in turn get triggered or react in negative ways. And so this is all part of the importance and relevance of this kind of way of working with people. Anthony mentions isolation, absolutely. And so when that isolation we see, let's face it, there may be many reasons, but there's a good chance it's related to avoidance, as you say, Anthony. All right, so just a few more things about trauma. I call it entering the shadows because this is always a hard place to go in our minds, but I think we also have to go there at least briefly today. I'm just going to suggest to you that trauma is a thief and ask, would you type in the chat box the things that come to your mind that get stolen as a result of significant trauma in people's lives, both what we're experiencing here and now, but also past trauma and incidences. And so, yeah, these come to mind pretty readily, don't they? A sense of peace and connection and trust and innocence and dignity and confidence and physical health, joy. Yeah, joy, says Beverly, absolutely. Your emotions are impacted, your quality of life in every way, virtue, yeah, all these things and so much more. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I have this special trick where I take everything that you all type in the chat box and I quickly make a slide that shows all those things. There it is. How about that? Just kidding. But all of these things and more are things that get stolen. And as you can see, this is very, very critical to one's sense of well-being, on how we operate in the world. And what hasn't been mentioned here, but also is part of that trauma, is racism and sexism and homophobia and all of these things that press down on people. This historic trauma, this insidious trauma is also part of what people experience. Where does it come from? Well, a number of sources. There's, stress itself is not good or bad. Stress is stress. Some of you are feeling stressed right now just because maybe you had other things to do and were a little late getting here, or maybe you're feeling like you have other things you have to do. But it's mostly what we'll call good stress or eustress. And it's the stress that also is about excitement of, maybe going somewhere new, and you have a little bit of anxiety about it. But most of the time, that kind of stress is perfectly fine. It's what I experience when I cook. I'm a little stressed because I'm really never sure how it's going to turn out. There's also negative stress that we experience, and oftentimes this might be related to overworking or not taking care of our bodies or our minds or our spirits. It might have feeling like we have too little time, too little resources, and that's negative stress that impacts us. It doesn't rip us apart, but nonetheless it's impactful. It's when we move to traumatic stress that things really get really problematic and difficult. And traumatic stress, as many of you know, can take many, many forms. And for many people, it's that overwhelming sense that impacts their body, a person's body, mind, and spirit. It's related to interpersonal violence, to all of the homelessness, community violence, to, as I said, racism, sexism, homophobia, and so much more. And then it turns to post-traumatic stress when there is an ongoing recurrence of remembering and flashbacks and physical symptoms that relate back to a time when the actual trauma is no longer present necessarily, but it's still as if it is. So this is a very quick overview, but this is, I think, worth thinking about in terms of the fact that trauma comes from many different places. Sometimes these are natural disasters, sometimes they're human events, sometimes it's insidious, sometimes it's historic. We could go into all that, but for now, I'll just say these are the things that, the places we might find trauma coming from. So what are we talking about? We're talking about something that is overwhelmingly demanding something on our physiological system, at least initially and primarily. And then what happens is that permeates as our brains and our bodies are impacted by this overwhelming demand that in which our body responds to protect us, that results in a lot of other physical, emotional, and other symptoms. And so one can look at the human stress response as very normal and very protective. And at the same time, you can see yourself probably in a variety of these responses. You notice for yourself that maybe your eyes dilate a bit, or you get a little tense, or your stomach starts feeling a bit upset. I think people experience these things in different ways. But what's happening is this stress response is related to the amount of the cortisol, the adrenaline, stress hormones, if you will, that are being released by our bodies to help us find some kind of balance and some kind of bringing us back to a sense of normal. What happens for people with chronic stress is that this physiological stress of these hormones actually becomes kind of commonplace, and it's almost as if you're living in an ongoing way with an increased kind of sense of adrenaline running through your body. And I think you all know what that feels like. And this can be very debilitating and impact our lives in many ways. So a few more things, and then I'll pass it on to Annie. One of the things we need to know about trauma is that for some people, long after the actual event has passed, that the brain is trained to continue to keep protecting us. And so it keeps sending signals to the body to escape a threat that's no longer there. And there's a saying that, you know, trauma that's not transformed is transmitted. And so this is one of the reasons why helping people, facilitating post-traumatic growth, helping people move towards finding a sense of calm and being able to address the trauma in a variety of ways is so critical, so that the brain can return to a state to allow people to live a little bit more normally. Being traumatized, and I'll just say these are quotes from Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, one of many great sources out there, but one certainly I recommend. But being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, and as if every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. And I think, again, every time I think about this, and I think about it as I've witnessed it in other people and even in myself, this is an amazing thing to have happening in your life. And so the lens through which someone sees the world is very much tainted, if you will, by fear, by distress, by concerns, by worry, by fear, and so on and so forth. Trauma almost invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, not being taken into account, by being ignored, by not being listened to, by not even receiving that knowing smile from somebody, by not even being asked how you feel or think about something or what your wisdom is about something. This is all part of that essence of the trauma experience. And ultimately, it results in a loss of connection to ourselves, to our own bodies, our families, to others, the world around us. And connection is something that I know many of you have heard people say the opposite of connection or the opposite of addiction is connection. And the opposite of health in general, I think, is connection. And this is something we could explore a whole lot more and will in the course that will be upcoming. But for now, I want to just leave this as a kind of a summary and a bridge. Does anybody recognize this art form and what it's called? You'll get extra points if you do. If you don't, it's quite all right. But these are an image, if you will, of Japanese art form. Kintsugi, yeah. Now, it was a Kintsukuroi, but I'm going to go with Kintsugi too. But this is indeed an interesting art form that is a Japanese art of mending pottery that's been broken and using gold, silver, other colors of lacquer to bring that pot back into life and even to create a stronger and more compelling and more beautiful image, if you will, in this case, than before. And I think this will serve as a nice bridge to the piece that Annie is going to lead us into, because I think that one of the things we know about trauma is that recovery is possible, and that's the good news. So with that, Annie, I'm going to pass it on to you, if I may.
Yeah, Ken, thank you for the great metaphor and just the really thoughtful discussion of trauma and the ways that it impacts us. So let's now add on to this by talking a little bit more directly about post-traumatic growth. And I was reflecting about the connection between trauma-informed care and post-traumatic growth. And maybe you've heard this suggestion that comes up within trauma-informed care, that we need to shift from asking what's wrong with them when someone's acting in a way that we find challenging or it doesn't seem like it serves them. And instead we need to start asking what happened to them, so that then we can examine ways that we can support that person. And I think that when we want to add post-traumatic growth into the conversation, we're shifting the question yet again. So instead of just saying what happened to this person, we're saying what did they survive, how did they survive it, and what have been both the negative and any positive consequences of that. And post-traumatic growth is this blanket term that refers to those positive effects that are sometimes very surprising that people sometimes discover or describe after struggling with a really difficult experience. So before we dive into the science of post-traumatic growth and what we know about, who experiences it and what it is and how to foster it, I wanted to do a quick poll to get your take, your perspective on this. So there's going to be 2 questions for you. And the first is this: in your professional life, have you ever worked with a client, a member, a person, whatever terminology you would use, who has experienced some sort of positive growth because of having grappled with trauma or adversity? This is great. Thanks for the engagement. Keep them coming. And we have people in the chat box saying, yes, you have seen this. And overwhelmingly in the poll, it looks like people are saying, yes, I've absolutely seen this in my professional world. Last chance to weigh in on this poll before we move to the second question. All right. And Marcia, if you would take us to the next question. Do you reflect on your own personal experiences? Do you feel that you've ever experienced some sort of positive growth as a result of having grappled with trauma or adversity. Whether that's a large or small change, whether it lasted or it was something that you experienced at a certain time and perhaps lost track of. Have you ever experienced some sort of positive growth? And we again, thank you for the engagement. We have a lot of people saying yes in both the poll and the chat box. Great. So thank you, Marcia, for that poll. And I'd invite you to continue reflecting on both these professional and personal experiences as we go along and unpack this idea of post-traumatic growth. All right, so we're going to touch briefly on 3 topics here. What is post-traumatic growth? What do we mean by it? What makes it more likely? And how might we be able to facilitate it with folks that we serve? All right, so this is a quote from Ben Franklin. The school where I did my graduate training had this really intense fixation with Ben Franklin, so the entire campus is literally paved with things that he said. And so this is a Ben Franklin quote. He said, "There are no gains without pains." And Ben Franklin didn't invent this idea in 1745. This is an idea that shows up in religious and spiritual traditions, in philosophical traditions, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The idea that somehow when we suffer, there can be something redemptive or something transformative that can come from that. And within the last 25 to 30 years, scientists have really gotten on board with studying this and trying to help us understand this phenomenon of how some people are able to wrest some sort of gains, some sort of growth or transformation from this suffering and this struggle. And so usually you'll see this called post-traumatic growth in the science, but you'll also see some other terms come up like stress-related growth, adversarial growth, benefit finding, and altruism born of suffering, which is referring to how specifically sometimes the growth that we get from trauma is being able to be more compassionate, more connected, more empathic, more effective in our relationships and our support of other people. So when we're looking at this science, when we're talking, from a psychological perspective, what do we mean? What is post-traumatic growth? So it's any sort of positive change that a person might experience as a result of struggling with a crisis or trauma. And I really want to underline the word struggle here, because we're not saying that the crisis or trauma directly produces growth and is therefore good. We're saying, no, if there is any growth, it is born of the struggle, the hard work that the person is doing in grappling with this experience and making sense of this trauma. So I want to ask you, what does this look like? Most of you said that either you know someone who has experienced some kind of PTG or you personally have. I would love if people would, in the chat box, share some examples of what this type of positive change or growth might look like. Greater resilience, creative expression, changes in behaviors, absolutely, not just emotions and thoughts, but how we're acting and showing up, determination to overcome, empathy, recovery from addiction. These are awesome. Please keep them coming. Confidence, advocacy, absolutely, trying to actually change these systems that do traumatize people, reframing mind and perspective, making career changes, absolutely, striking out in a new direction, reframing, emotional response, self-care, relating to others in the deeper level. Thank you so much for these. These are so rich. We could go on for quite a time kind of sharing these examples. So I want to share 5 big categories of post-traumatic growth that come up, and maybe you'll recognize these examples and experiences and observations in these 5 common categories. These are not necessarily the be-all, end-all. A really common one, like you all are saying in the chat box, is about relationships. For instance, someone just shared, preventing suffering of others and helping others using personal experiences, being a role model. Absolutely, people find that even though in some ways trauma can damage relationships, we know this, right? It can interfere with trust. It can interfere with connection. Paradoxically, it can also sometimes bring people closer together, either by helping us realize that we do need other people and we are vulnerable and letting people in, or as you all are saying, having that increased compassion and empathy and drive to connect and help other people. I love that, Jimmy. Everything begins and ends with relationships. The second category, which again you all already called out, is personal strength. This feeling of determination, this feeling that if I survive that, I can do all of this stuff. I can do anything if I already made my way through that. Another is a greater appreciation of life. And as part of that, more clarity about what really matters, what we're really grateful for, what our true priorities are, and a willingness to really recommit to those and take the time to cherish them and tend those. Another, new possibilities. It looks like folks also called out this in the chat, the sense that there are some new pathways for me to pursue that I hadn't seen before or that weren't there before. So even as trauma can be a thief, as Ken described, and it can take away so many things, sometimes people say, well, I discovered that in the midst of all these things I was losing, there were some new pathways that I could walk down to find something else and gain and grab hold of something else. Absolutely new purpose in life. And then the final one that's really common is changes in spirituality. People saying that, they have a deeper understanding of spiritual matters than they did before. Now, let's talk also about what post-traumatic growth is not. So it's important to me to put this stuff out there from the beginning. The existence of post-traumatic growth, the possibility of post-traumatic growth, is not a justification for allowing violence or harm or trauma, glorifying it or saying that it's good for us. And likewise, it's not a reason to stop or devalue any of our efforts to prevent people from going through trauma or providing therapy and treatment and trauma-informed care to help people deal with all of the wounds and the losses and the negative consequences of trauma. It also shouldn't be a standard to hold people to. I think that when we're going through a really dark time and we're just struggling to survive it, the last thing that we need is someone and saying, well, the bar is up here. Not only do you have to get through this, but you have to completely transform your personality, character, relationships, life, spiritual understanding, and so forth. So it shouldn't be something that is placed as a demand. Barbara Ehrenreich calls this bright-siding people when we insist that they have to be so positive about things. And then finally, I want to say that post-traumatic growth is not really the same thing as resilience or recovery. And this might be a time where I'm just being a nerdy scientist about it, and maybe it's not as important to make these distinctions, but I think this is going to come up in a minute, to see why this matters. So the way that I think of post-traumatic growth is that it is about some sort of positive transformation, some sort of gain or development of something good that wasn't necessarily there before. The way that I think of resilience, or the way that we talk about it in the science of resilience, is that resilience is sort of about getting through the storm mostly unscathed. So we go through a really difficult time, but we're able to pretty quickly bounce back without too much disruption, too much suffering, too much experience of feeling traumatized as we go through trauma. I think of recovery as, going through that really dark, difficult time, and yes, absolutely struggling, absolutely having a lot of suffering and a lot of disruption because the extent of that adversity that we're going through is just so great. And then the recovery is pulling through that and healing. Post-traumatic growth can happen with either of these, right? You could go through this storm and bounce back pretty quickly, and you could experience some positive growth. You could go through recovery where you go through a really painful, difficult, disrupted, awful time and still experience post-traumatic growth. So that's part of why I think it's important to be clear about these terms, is that sometimes post-traumatic growth is talked about as the opposite of post-traumatic stress. And in a way that's true, but they can happen together. Someone can be experiencing a lot of post-traumatic stress or negative consequences of trauma and be in that process of recovery and be experiencing growth. So we'll unpack that more in a moment. Who experiences post-traumatic growth? What makes it more likely? These are the sort of questions that really made me want to become a psychologist and understand this, because I had gone through difficult experiences myself, and I was also working trying to serve people who'd gone through really, really difficult experiences, who were coming out of prison unhoused with histories of challenges with substances, histories of challenges with trauma and mental health issues. And some people were able to really transcend this in very, very remarkable ways, and some people got very stuck in cycles. And I'm sure you've seen both of these things happen. And I wanted to understand what makes that difference, where some people go on to experience this growth and others don't seem to, or seem to struggle with that more, or it's going to be much longer in coming. What makes that difference, and what can we learn from the people who are experiencing this growth? So one thing we know is that post-traumatic growth is pretty common. As we saw from you all saying, yes, you've absolutely seen it and experienced it. The numbers are different across different studies, but it looks like about 60% of people who go through serious adversity will have some sort of positive growth that they describe coming from it. And this is especially common in people who have suffered more. So again, post-traumatic growth is not necessarily at the opposite end of the spectrum from post-traumatic stress. They can happen together. And it actually looks like people who experience more struggle, distress, suffering, post-traumatic stress symptoms also actually report more post-traumatic growth. Now, there's also a limit to it. So if you picture sort of an upside-down U, this is part of what we find as well, is that if you're at kind of a medium level of disruption and distress from trauma, it seems like those are the people who are most likely to report some growth. If you have only the tiniest bit of stress in your life, you're probably just going on about your day and not really doing much of that struggle or grappling that might produce growth. And at the other end, if you have just a crushing amount of trauma and distress and suffering and disruption, it might also be very hard, at least in that time, to be transmuting that into growth. But there's absolutely this relationship where people who have suffered more tend to be more likely to experience growth. And I bring this up not just because it's sort of an interesting science fact, but I think it's really inspiring because it tells us that if we are struggling and suffering, it doesn't mean that we are lost, that we have failed, that we are only going to continue to suffer. To me, it's this hopeful message that that actually might be the thing that opens the door to us having that transformational experience. Now, the other thing is there's a lot of information about people with certain traits or experiences or coping styles being more likely to experience PTG. So I would love to hear what you've noticed. What are your guesses, your hypotheses? Post in the chat box. Who do you think is most likely to experience PTG? We have some ideas about motivation, intelligence, support and connection. Adaptability, self-love, self-compassion, that's showing up as more and more important, a sense of self. People who have those depending on them, growth mindset. I love these. Please feel free to keep them coming while I show you some of the things we've learned from the science around this. So what you're seeing in this slide is some of the things that have been most consistently linked to experiencing post-traumatic growth. And the bigger the font size, the stronger the relationship. So you'll see that some of the biggest things are what we call positive appraisal, which is people who are inclined to look for the positive and look for the growth opportunities. People who cope through religious and spiritual means, people who are optimistic, as Jessica said in the chat box, people who have a lot of support. And you can also see things like acceptance, being able to accept the losses and accept the struggle that we're going through. Now you'll also see it's interesting that denial is also at the bottom of the slide in sort of a smaller size. And there's a whole controversy that we're not going to get into right now about how much of our experience of growth is kind of an ongoing coping process of us talking ourselves into the idea that we're growing as a way to deal with everything we're going through. So that's kind of an interesting one. We could talk for hours about that controversy. Something that you don't see up here, right, is you don't see a lot about age and gender and race and ethnicity and things like that. There are some very small effects of those sort of demographic things, but mostly we see that the bigger effects are things like the ones on this slide that are ways that we respond to adversity, right? And so again, I think that this is a hopeful, empowering message because it says, hey, these are things that are changeable. The way that we cope, the way that we view the world with optimism or pessimism, and so forth. Okay, so then the big question, right, is how can we facilitate post-traumatic growth in the people that we work with? You know, and one thing that I want to say up front is before we even get into specifics, I think a lot of how we can facilitate PTG is just by being there as a supportive, empathic person, right, and responding in those trauma-informed ways that you also beautifully described at the very beginning of this webcast when Ken was asking about that. We can just be there to help create safety and love and care and create that kind of that baseline from which people can do some of this work. And I love people are also chiming in with other ideas like validation, sharing our own struggles, support that creates trust, absolutely. As someone said before, it begins and ends with relationships, right? So just being there in relationship with someone is so foundational. Now, again, if you get into this community of people that study post-traumatic growth, a lot of people like to ask this question of should we even be trying to foster or facilitate post-traumatic growth? And there are some really valid concerns about the risks and the downsides of this. You know, could trying to foster post-traumatic growth make people feel bright-sided, invalidated, pressured, badly about themselves? Could it take away from a focus that they need on other sorts of healing? And there's this question of just do we know enough yet about post-traumatic growth to charge ahead with trying to foster it? I think that's a good question. I think the better questions, though, are when should we try to facilitate PTG? At what point as someone's grappling with the trauma? With whom? Who's going to be most receptive to this kind of work? How can we do it? How should we do it? And what are the risks and benefits of trying to add a focus on post-traumatic growth into the work with the people that we serve? And again, I'm seeing some great stuff in the chat box about basic active listening and validating people's trauma. We absolutely have to have that foundation. We can't just rush in and say, so tell me about all the good stuff that's coming from this. Yeah, and great comments about the timing when they are willing to accept help or when they express interest in this topic. So I want to share with you 3 thoughts I have about ways that we can facilitate post-traumatic growth in addition to this foundational support and validation and trust. So the first I would suggest is we can gently, curiously, respectfully explore this. We can invite people to reflect on this. So this is different than saying, hey, listen, there's this awesome thing, post-traumatic growth, and you can experience it from going through trauma, and I want you to tell me about all of your growth, and I'm going to make you have more. No, this is really about just extending an invitation and saying something like, you know, we've been talking a lot about these really painful losses that you've had from struggling with this event. And, you know, sometimes people find that alongside those losses and that pain, that they might see some other sorts of changes emerging, some that are more welcome, some that they find to be more positive. And I'm wondering for you if you've ever noticed something like that. And if the person says, no, absolutely not, great, we have our answer that this is not the time and place to be trying to facilitate PTG directly. We can go back to that other sort of healing-centered engagement. But we can extend this invitation. Tedeschi and Calhoun, who were some of the guys that pioneered this science 25 years ago, they have this lovely term, expert companionship. So it's just about being with someone on their journey and having a little bit of a perspective and skill set that we can offer as we're with them. I've also done a little bit of work with chaplains, and they introduced me to this beautiful verb of companioning, which I had not heard in therapy traditions used in that way, but I love this, companioning with someone in this experience. The second is that we can try to increase facilitative factors. What do I mean by that? I mean all that stuff a couple slides ago that we saw was helpful for experiencing PTG, right? Helping them to explore different ways of coping, helping them with acceptance, helping them with the ways that they are grappling with this trauma, helping them with social support, either by providing it directly or by helping them to get more support in their relationships out in the world, by helping to make sure they're in a safe environment where they can do this work. So by helping to promote all those sorts of experiences in their life, that can also indirectly foster PTG. And Jim had a question, what was that word? If you want to clarify, I'm happy to clarify in turn. And in the meanwhile, Unzi, I really love this idea of approach people when they're in an upper brain state rather than a lower brain state, so help people with emotional regulation so that they can get in a place that they can do some of this kind of calmer reflection. So yes, companioning, great. Thanks, Marissa, for picking up what Jim was putting down. Yeah. And then the third way that we might be able to facilitate post-traumatic growth is by using more sort of specific approaches, styles, interventions, techniques, right? So there's been a ton of studies done at this point about trying to understand what we can do in therapy to foster post-traumatic growth. And I may have read almost every single one of them, and I wrote up a review kind of synthesizing a bunch of them. And the good news, team, is that what we find is overall, a lot of different therapy styles can foster post-traumatic growth. And it looks like on the whole, just being in therapy fosters growth before we even try to do any specific stuff. Now, what we don't know yet is what is sort of the perfect recipe for things to do in therapy to try to foster growth. But we have some ideas about specific things that might be helpful. And we'll get into these more in a longer course. But they include things like helping someone look at their life narrative, at the story they tell themselves about their life, and how the traumatic event or events fit into that. How do they kind of write that into the story? How do they understand it? How do they write their next chapters based on where they're at now and the trauma that they've gone through? Other sorts of approaches are things like helping to appreciate sort of paradoxes or dialectics, that it can be simultaneously true that you have this intense loss and growth, and neither one makes the other one any less real or any less valid. And also, we talked about how one form of post-traumatic growth is about seeing new possibilities for your life. And so another thing that we might be able to do in therapy is help people to identify those paths or those doors that are opening to them, given where they're at right now with everything that they've gone through. So as we wrap up, I want to, again, turn to you all for your wisdom and experience about this. So 2 questions for you. The first is, when we are companioning, when we are trying to gently, supportively create a space where people might experience growth, what are some things not to say? Things that are going to make someone feel invalidated or pressured, things that are just not going to be helpful when we're trying to talk specifically about growth. So I'll get us rolling by saying, you know what you really just need to do is stop thinking about all these negatives and look on the bright side of your trauma. What are some other things that would probably for a lot of people not be helpful? Absolutely, you should be over this by now. It's not that bad. Focus on the positive. You should have, you could have. Why are you feeling like this? Other people have it much worse. Don't, can't, snap out of it. You're overreacting. And maybe some of us have heard these, right? And maybe some of us can even feel right now the pain or the wound of being talked to like this. And the person saying it might have really positive intentions, right? They might really want to support us in transforming this and getting through it and healing. And yet sometimes it comes out like this and it has exactly the opposite effect. So the next question for you is, what are some more helpful things to say? To, again, respectfully, gently invite people to reflect on opportunities for growth. What would it mean to you if? And something that I think Ken and I probably both talk about in motivational interviewing trainings is that often questions that start with what can be more helpful than ones that start with why. Earlier, someone had a why question on our list of things to not say, and I like these what questions. What would it mean to you? What would it be like? I'm here whenever you're ready. We can work on this together. We can take small steps. I'm here to go along this journey with you. I love that, just describing the way that we want to be a companion to them. Acknowledge the growth when it's on display. Call it out, name it, and invite them to discuss it. And invite the person to own how huge of a step it is. I think so often as therapists, we are trained to, and we have the natural instinct to, focus on all of the problems, the pain, the things that need to be fixed, the ineffective coping. And doing post-traumatic growth work is about inviting ourselves and retraining our own brain to notice this and to acknowledge it, to discuss it, and express interest in it. I love these. Do you know of others with similar situations how did you see them managing this? Acknowledge the positive coping skills that they already have. Please, please keep these going as we get ready to wrap up here. So, yeah, I think we can take a minute for this, Ken, right? As we wrap up, I would love if people would add in the chat box one or the other of these things. Either a takeaway from the last hour, something that was interesting and you want to remember or hold on to, or something you're curious to learn more about. Go ahead and type in one takeaway or one thing you're curious about.
And Annie, while you're taking that in, I noticed that Jimmy had a question earlier whether does PTG just happen over time without some form of involvement of somebody else, I think is the implication.
As in like outside of therapy. Yeah, and this is what's super interesting is that it seems like as with natural recovery, where sometimes people recover from mental health or substance challenges without professional support, excuse me, the same is true of post-traumatic growth. Absolutely. So in the early studies of this, this was mostly based on interviews and surveys with two groups of people, veterans with combat experience and people who'd survived sexual assault. And so these were not people who'd gone through necessarily therapy for it or much less post-traumatic growth therapy for it, but just naturalistically they were reporting in these interviews these forms of growth. So as you continue adding in your takeaway or something you want to learn about, I'll just share with you a few resources that you might use to learn more. There's some great books and now a post-traumatic growth workbook. You can watch Rich Tedeschi, one of the pioneers of this work, do a talk available on YouTube. And we'll be doing this course in October and November, which Ken is going to share a bit more about. I just want to leave you with my gratitude for you, not only for your engagement here today, but for the work that you do. I'm moved by this quote that anyone who willingly enters into the pain of a stranger is truly a remarkable person. And I know that you all do that work day in and day out. That is why you're here, is because you are people who want to hold space for people in pain and work with them to alleviate it. So thank you, thank you, thank you for this crucial work that you do in our communities while you're bearing your own burdens and struggles along the way. Thanks to C4 collaborators that I've done PTG research with, and mostly to you all for your engagement and insight. And Ken, I'll turn it over to you for any closing and words that you want to say about the course.
Sure. Thank you so much, Annie. Just a really wonderful, provocative, evocative presentation. Just to notice, somebody asked about the availability of the PowerPoint slides. We won't have the PowerPoint slides available, but we will have a recording of this webcast available in which you can see the slides and listen again if you wish. And I just wanted to note a comment that somebody just made. I forget who it was. Rita said that PTG is a lifeline. I think that's a beautiful summary and it'd be interesting to talk more. So just to say, there are a number of different trainings that we offer through C4 around trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practice. Some of these are self-paced. Some of those are related to live online learning. Some are on site whenever and if that becomes possible again to do when the pandemic eases. We also do a lot around not only training around trauma-informed care, but also implementation of that kind of approach within an organization. And we have a tachometer, which is a validated instrument that measures the level of trauma-informedness, if you will, that exists in an organization. And then we consult with people about how to increase their level of trauma-informed practice. And I'll leave this with you. These are some places to go on the web to learn more. And we would be most delighted if you would consider signing up for a course or two and continuing this journey with us. So I'll just wrap up and say thank you once again to all of you for being here and for your really wonderful engagement in the chat box in particular. And Annie, thank you so much for your presence and your wonderful presentation today. And with that, I'll bid you all farewell.
And one last thank you that I want to say before signing off, which is thank you to Marcia, who has been taking care of everything behind the scenes and making this go so smoothly for us. So thank you to Marcia and C4 for making this all come together. Team, I'm going to hang out for just a couple minutes in case there's any questions in the chat box that I can briefly answer. I think I saw a question asking about some of the academic resources, so I can share some things like that in the chat, and then we'll say farewell to you.
I see there's a question about, maybe it's more a curiosity, about encouraging PTG in the homelessness sector for people having experienced all kinds of trauma. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Annie. Is there any reason?
I mean, it's such a good question and a rich topic. And, here's my general take. I think that certainly there's a lot to be said about the idea of a hierarchy of needs, right? But I think sometimes we can take that a little bit too far or too literally. And so I'll hear people say, well, something like post-traumatic growth or finding meaning and purpose in your experience, that's not really relevant until you have.
Ooh, we just lost
Can you hear me?
You guys. Oh, there we go. Keep talking.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we can take the idea of the hierarchy of needs a little bit too seriously or too far and say that it's not relevant to people to consider things like post-traumatic growth or meaning or purpose until all their more basic needs are met, like safety and food and housing. And absolutely we need to meet those needs. I don't want to take anything away from that. But I also want to give people enough credit to say that I think a lot of times these questions of meaning and purpose and finding ways to transform suffering are so relevant when people are really in the thick of great adversity. And so I don't think that we need to say, oh, it's not relevant to people until we do all of these other things. Certainly, I used to work in transitional housing, and I found people were having very deep and meaningful engagement with these sorts of concepts in their own lives. And Ken, I know you do a lot of work in that space. I wonder what your thoughts are.
I think the only thing I would say to support what you just said is that homelessness is a condition, it's not a trait. And too often I think we confuse the two. So I absolutely believe that PTSG or PTG is absolutely relevant and accessible for anyone, regardless of the conditions in which they're living. Quick question, and I know we need to cut out here, but also around people who have been exploited through human trafficking and sexual exploitation. You want to give a quick response, Annie, and then we'll probably have to regard that as the last question.
Ken, let me let you take that one. I'm just popping a couple resources in the box, and I'm not very thoughtful multitasker.
Okay. Well, without having thought through it a whole lot more, I guess I would say a similar response to what we just talked about around people experiencing homelessness. People's individual circumstances are all different, of course, within these categories, so we always have to take that into account. But I guess my suggestion is that there is no one who is beyond the possibility of experiencing post-traumatic growth. And sometimes that will look, it'll be very incremental, and sometimes it will be pretty eye-popping. But nonetheless, my own philosophy of care is that we need to treat everyone as if they have growth and potential, and trust that they'll find that way, and that we'll do the best we can to facilitate that. And it doesn't always turn out the way we want, but it's always amazing to me how many people do, in fact, experience that positive growth when we just hang in there with them and are present with them, and we companion them. All right. Thank you so much, folks. You want to have the last word there, Annie? Something you want to say yet?
No, I have no final words to share except just, again, thank you to everyone for the really thoughtful engagement. I always learn from people's comments and questions every time I do a training, so really appreciate the chance. All right.
Bye-bye all.
Bye, Ken. Bye, all.